Hello friends, I am Professor Ajmer Singh Malik, teaching Public Administration at Kurukshetra University, Kurukshetra. As we interacted in the previous talk on the internal financial resources of Panchayati Raj and promised that we will take up the external financial resources of the Panchayati Raj institutions in another talk. So, now after discussing the internal financial resources of Panchayats, let's take up the external financial resources of the Panchayati Raj institution. The Panchayati Raj institutions are also endowed with additional financial resources to make these institutions financially viable and sustainable. Such financial empowerment is undertaken by allowing these institutions to levy new taxes, assigning or sharing specific new or existing taxes, and disbursing grants. It is somewhat like the sharing of financial resources between center and the states. And now in case of the Panchayati Raj institution, we can say it is sharing or assigning the resources between the panchayats and the central government as well as from state government to the Panchayati Raj institution, means somewhat more than the resources which are shared and assigned in between the center and the state governments. So, let us take up those resources. First of all, let us talk about the State Finance Commission and the Central Finance Commissions respectively. These commissions are performing their tasks as envisaged in the 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act. The State Finance Commission, which is established under the provision of Article 243I, provides for the constitution of a State Finance Commission in each state, and it is primarily to ensure appropriate fiscal devolutions from state to the panchayats. I again emphasize this fact, that is, the financial resources which are assigned or which are devolved to the Panchayati Raj institutions are by the state legislature, and that is why we can say the panchayats are not having any kind of independent of sources of tax which can be levied, collected and appropriated by them, but they are sharing, or we say the mechanism, or rather we say the institution of the State Finance Commission has been established under this provision 243I to make that the financial resources, or we say the proceeds of the states, the income of the states may be shared with the Panchayati Raj institution, and that is why the commission is expected to function as an independent constitutional body, primarily to decide the division of finance which affects the fiscal status of the state government. In fact, it is the agent of the state legislature which would examine the action taken report by the government on the proposal of the commission along with an explanatory memorandum, particularly in case of deviations from the recommendations of the commission. In simple words, I would like to elaborate it in a different manner. What happens? The state government constitute a State Finance Commission like the Central Finance Commission after every 5 years. We will discuss this kind of the things in a separate module, and we say that is under the State Finance Commission. The second thing is that State Commission, keeping in view the responsibilities assigned and or the expenditure requirement of the Panchayati Raj institutions and the availability of the funds with the state government, or which can be shared as per the provision made there in the law, or we say that the statutory provision to that effect is there. Then it recommends to the state government, it prepares a report and recommend that what kind of the resources or what type of the financial resources and how much financial resources are to be transferred to the local governments in the state, that is both the Panchayati Raj institution and the urban local bodies. And the report is submitted to the governor after sending it to the respective department, and the action taken by those departments, that report is placed before the state legislature for the discussion and the deliberations in the state legislative assembly. So this is how we say it is expected, like in the Central Finance Commission, that the recommendations made by the State Finance Commission will also be accepted by the state government also in case of the State Finance Commission recommendations. So this is a general kind of the perception that the recommendations will be accepted, but it is not always true. The State Finance Commission in real sense recommends the tax income to the panchayats. The Commission adopts a standard methodology for normative assessment of the revenue receipts and expenditures of the local bodies, as I stated earlier. I am just repeating in the here just to make you clarify and just to focus this issue. That's only the taxes which are to be shared, and again expenditure and the responsibilities of the Panchayati Raj institution is taken into consideration while making the recommendations, while the State Finance Commission is making recommendation in this regard. The receipt includes potential and actual collections of property taxes, occupation, profession taxes, rent, etc., and expenditures are like maintenance of assets and staff discharge of statutory civic functions, etc. The State Finance Commission takes such receipts and expenditure into consideration and recommends the devolution of the resources to the panchayat from the consolidated fund of the state concerns. Besides this, the Central Finance Commission also takes into consideration the reports of the State Finance Commission for recommending devolution of the financial resources to the local bodies, both urban local bodies and rural local bodies, or you call it Panchayati Raj institutions. Kerala is an example where about 3/8 of the financial resources of the state are assigned to the panchayats. But the panchayats in other states may not be so lucky in this regard. The 13th Finance Commission recommended that the State Finance Commissions should consider the devolving the share of tax income instead of fixed grant, because that will ensure the sustainable progress of the financial resources of the panchayats with the increase in the proceeds of collection of tax-based income of the state. In a very simple way, let's take up in a very simple manner. There are certain taxes. The collection or the proceeds of those taxes increases every year because of their flexibility and elasticity. And as a result of that, the income of the state concerned because of these elastic taxes that increasing. But the State Finance Commission normally adopts a very traditional approach, that is making grants, that how much money is to be devolved. But the 13th Finance Commission simply states that it should not be a fixed amount. Rather, it should be a proportion of the proceeds collected from such taxes which are elastic one, and that should be shared with the Panchayati Raj institutions and the state government. So that will help in ensuring the financial sustenance to the Panchayati Raj institutions. So this is the role, or this is an important source of financial resources, external financial resources to the Panchayati Raj institution, like the urban local bodies in the state. Now let's take up another important source and very stable source of external financial resources to the Panchayati Raj institution. This is the Central Finance Commission, which is established under Article 280 of the Constitution. And the practice starts from the 10th Finance Commission. The 10th Finance Commission, when constituted, did not have local finance in its terms of reference. But with the enactment and adoption of 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act, it became obliged to recommend the measures needed to augment the consolidated fund of the state for supplementing the resources of panchayats and the municipalities. In simple words, I would like to explain you that at the time when the 10th Finance Commission was constituted, there was no reference that it will make recommendation to devolve the financial resources to the Panchayati Raj institutions and the urban local bodies. But in the meantime, 73rd and 74th Amendment Act were passed, And since the provisions have been made in Article 280, the provisions, rather we say inserted in the Article 280, that it is the responsibility of the Finance Commission, we are saying it as a Central Finance Commission, that it will recommend to devolve the funds to the local governments also. And as a result of that, since it was in between, therefore the 10th Finance Commission made certain recommendations to augment the funds of the Panchayati Raj Institution as envisaged in Article 280 or as per the provision of the 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act. The 10th Finance Commission recommended the grants for Panchayati Raj Institutions, and it assessed at the rate of rupees per capita as per 1971 census. And interstates distribution was made on the basis of the population ratio of the states. Again, I would like to explain that the 10th Finance Commission made a recommendation at the rate of rupees 100 per person per year will be devolved to the Panchayati Raj institutions. And the number of persons of that state will be considered on the basis of 1971 census. And another important thing is, that is, in case of interstate, how much money is to be, how much grant is to be disbursed to a particular state, that will also be based on the 1971 population. The 11th Finance Commission recommended that the amount to be devolved and distributed to panchayats among states must be based upon the criteria and weights comprising of population 40%, index of decentralization 20%, distance from highest per capita income 20%, revenue efforts 10%, and geographical area 10%. Let me explain that the Panchayati Raj institutions, as per the recommendation of the 11th Finance Commission, are to be financed or funded keeping in view the size of population, the size of area, because it is difficult to manage a bigger state. Then again, the per capita income means the Panchayati Raj institution in poorer states may require more funds in comparison to the other one. But at the same time, incentive is also given to those states which decentralized the powers and the functions to the Panchayati Raj institution, as well as which has made sincere efforts to those states in collecting the funds or in collecting the taxes not imposed, levied by the Panchayati Raj institutions. Subsequently, the 12th Finance Commission suggested that levying certain taxes and user charges, prescribing minimum revenue collection, higher efficiency in tax collection, economy in expenditure, and transparency in functioning must be obligatory for Panchayati Raj institutions. Means they need to be financed more in comparison to others. The 13th Finance Commission reiterated the need to raise their own tax and non-tax revenues. The tax like property tax, profession tax, recovery of maintenance costs for delivering services like water supply, sewage disposal, and solid waste management, etc. It recommended to devolve a share of divisible tax to local bodies instead of grants, as stated earlier also. The 14th Finance Commission recommended that the distribution of grants to the states using 2011 population data with weight of 90% and area with weight of 10%. It also recommended that the grant to each state should be divided into two. Number one, a grant to duly constituted Gram Panchayats, and number two, a grant to duly constituted municipalities. on the basis of urban and rural population of that state using the data of census 2011. I remind you that 10th Finance Commission that recommended the devolution on the basis of the census population, that is of 1971. So therefore, it was updated by this commission. Further, the commission recommended grants is further divided into two parts, a basic grant and a performance grant for duly constituted gram panchayats and the municipalities. In case of gram panchayats, 90% of the grant is the basic grant and 10% is the performance grant. However, in case of the municipalities, the division between the basic and performance grant is on the 80-20 basis. After deliberating the role of State Finance Commission and the Central Finance Commission, the significant institutions established under the 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act and the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act, and that has become a perennial source of income or external financial resources for the panchayats as well as for the municipality. Let us take up the third types of the financial resource, which are very important for the performance of the different activities or the responsibilities assigned to the panchayats in particular, that is the grants in aid. Normally, grants in aid is an instrument through which local bodies or the Panchayati Raj institutions are endowed with requisite financial resources. This additional devolution enables these institutions to manage all those functions which could otherwise be not undertaken because of non-availability of sufficient funds or limited resource mobilization capacity. Means if the funds are not available, then that kind of the responsibility or activities may not be possible to be discharged by the Panchayati Raj institutions. The state government also provides grants to Panchayati Raj institution. Means grants are not only provided by the State Finance Commission or the Central Finance Commission. These are also provided by the State Finance Commission, and those were used to be provided even before the enactment of 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act. These grants means the grants provided by the state government are either in the form of subsidy or matching grants under various schemes. Various types of grants from the state includes grants to run, maintain and implement development schemes and establishment for staff expenses. Various types of grants from the state government includes grants to run, maintain and implement the development schemes, and the second is establishment grant, that is for the staff expenses, means the human resources hired for performing the activities, that kind of the grant. Subsidy is usually paid for the construction of scheduled caste and backward classes chopals. Matching grants provided for the constructions of public utility buildings and various other development schemes undertaken by panchayats. The Central Finance Commission have also been using this tool of grants in various forms, such as specific purpose grants, conditional or tied grants, means there are certain conditions, only on those conditions, on the basis of those conditions that grant be spent. And in case of the tied grants, means that the money or the funds devolved will be utilized only for the specific purpose, and that's why those are called as the tied grants. Then there are open, we can say, which are not tied, general purpose grants, untied grants and per capita grants, etc. The grants are also being extended under various centrally sponsored schemes under specific conditions for each and every schemes. Means the conditions are different in each and every kind of the scheme which are sponsored or funded by the central government. Apart from the State Finance Commission, the Central Finance Commission and the grants in aid, there is another external financial resource for Panchayati Raj institution. This is the institutional credit and the market borrowing. The panchayats are not generally allowed to raise loans on their own except loans from the state government. It is somewhat like that the state government cannot go outside the central government to borrow the money. And similarly, it is here. In case of the panchayats, they cannot go outside the state government to borrow money. It is true, but whilst they must keep their expenditure strictly within their income sources, so that a situation of deficit budget does not arise. Again, I would like to explain that the Panchayati Raj institutions are not allowed to spend more than their budget, and the strict vigilance or the strict limitation is imposed them in normal circumstances. This requirement results in, that is, binding them to spend or to make expenditure within the money available to them. So this kind of binding results in postponement or the avoidance of certain essential expenses, particularly capital based expenses, make the Panchayati Raj institution even more dependent on the state government. But Kerala is a leading state in establishing innovative practice in mobilizing financial resources for panchayats. Some of the gram panchayats borrowed loan under public-private partnership for constructing shopping mall, bus stand, etc. Again, I would like to explain that the Kerala has utilized the institutional finance or the borrowing other than the state governments under public-private partnership. That's the innovative approach. They devised the way how to create the assets for their institution so that there may be a regular income to the panchayats. So, these are the different external sources which are utilized or which are enriching or which are supplementing the incomes or the financial position of the panchayats in the country. So, let us conclude this talk by stating that various research studies reveal that there is a substantial variation across states in the level of financial sustenance of the panchayats and the types of the financial resources mobilized by them. It has also been observed that most of the state governments have retained substantial financial and administrative powers and have not devolved those to the panchayats established under the constitutional amendment. The institution of the State Finance Commission has also not been substantially successful in devolving financial resources to the panchayats, except in a few states in the country. Besides, the state governments also resort to restrictions on panchayat spendings even in case of their own funds. Thus, there is neither sufficient devolution of resources nor adequate revenue raising capacity is with the panchayats. Although most of the states have tax assignment as the major source of Panchayati Raj institutions, followed by tax sharing, but the dependence of the Panchayati Raj institutions on the state government is not found to be missing as envisaged in the amendment. Local resources are often found to be inadequate to carry out the assigned functions to these local institutions. So, with these observations, I would like to thank you for giving me a patience, listening, and wishing you a very, very happy learning. Thanks again.